We don't need a revolution, we need a restoration. We need to recognize that the governments we've had for 30 years have been a disaster, and we need to put it right. And once you see that, once you recognize it's not a question of Labour versus Tory or Tory versus Labour, but they've all been dreadful for 30 years, then you begin to see, okay, what is it we need to do?
Who now has anything to say about the deindustrialization of this country?
Georgian townhouses on the moon, the highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way. Small modular reactors under every village green. This is Anglo-Futurism.
Hello and welcome back to the King Charles III Space Station. I'm Tomo.
And I'm Calum Drysdale. Here on the KC3, we take the Telegraph.
And last weekend, it ran a piece by Douglas Carswell laying out what an incoming government would need to do to wind back the clock and undo the declinist damage to the system. An executive defibrillator to the chest, so to speak. Douglas will need little introduction to our listeners, but for those who've been living under a rock, he was first returned as the Conservative MP for Harwich in 2005. Many will remember him, however, because in August 2014, he defected to UKIP. Unusually, and we think to his credit, he resigned as an MP and stood in the subsequent by-election, which he was not required to do, which he then won.
A great influence on the coalition, he developed the idea of the Great Repeal Bill, which was passed by the coalition as the Protection of Freedoms Act 2012, which limited the government's ability to surveil and snoop on its voters, as well as strengthening the Freedom of Information Act, which we hope to talk more about later.
Douglas, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Of course, you're in this thatched space station with us, but where are you typically?
Typically, I'm in America, in Mississippi. I now live in the Deep South, Jackson, Mississippi, and I've been here now for 4 years.
And you work for a think tank there?
Yeah, I run something called the Mississippi Center for Public Policy, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it does what it says on the tin. We are, I would say, one of the leading free market think tanks in the US South, and we push for things like income tax abolition. And I'm delighted to say that yesterday we signed into law, not we, the think tank, we, the state of Mississippi, signed into law a bill that will eliminate income tax entirely in the state by 2037. So, yeah, we're pushing for free market reform in the US South.
Well, something must be working because Mississippi now has a higher GDP per capita than Britain.
It does. Free market reform really is working here. I mean, the state of Mississippi's per capita GDP has overtaken that of the UK. This year, we're due to overtake the per capita GDP of Germany. And it's entirely because of tax cuts, radical labor market deregulation, and a whole bunch of free market ideas that have been implemented by think tanks like ours over the past 3 or 4 years.
Well, Mississippi was a laggard, wasn't it? It used to be at the bottom of these tables for the states.
It is actually still the poorest state in the union. But really interestingly, I was looking at some incomplete data for 2024, which shows that Mississippi, according to the data from the first and second quarter of last year, had the 5th fastest growing per capita income and per capita GDP. So I think, rather like Ireland in the 1970s and 80s, you're beginning to see Mississippi take off and catch up exponentially. It's extraordinary to be part of it.
Well, to wit, I saw an interesting tweet from you, I think yesterday, and there was a window cleaning drone, which to those of us maroons in the 20th century in Europe was flabbergasting to see. Is that a typical sight in Mississippi these days?
Well, it's extraordinary because I happened to be reading an article. I'm one of those wonks who does this sort of thing. An article about how the rollout of drones for delivery in the UK has been held up because of some absurd regulation to do with aviation. I mean, it's rather reminiscent of about 100 years ago when the regulators in Britain said that in order to drive a so-called motor car, you had to have a man carrying a red flag walk in front of you. This sort of absurd regulatory approach to new technology in the UK is holding the country back. Well, here in Mississippi, I took a little video clip on my lunch break of a drone, a robo-drone, cleaning a building. It wasn't just cleaning windows, it was cleaning a building. And what was extraordinary, it was doing the job that I remember only 2 or 3 years ago a gang of 5 or 6 people would do on tall ladders. This is why American productivity, that little anecdote of how the job of 5 or 6 people is now being done by a single robo-drone, is a beautiful illustration of why American productivity is taking off. And I think it really is starting to take off now with AI and various other things. I can't help noticing that the cost of Teslas is plummeting, and living standards in America are now soaring. I mean, it's happening now. The future, the productivity takeoff because of technology is happening now. It really is extraordinary to witness it.
I suppose having moved from London to Mississippi, you probably have a house about 4 times as big as you would in London, and a massive car and so on.
It's bizarre how here in Mississippi, blue-collar workers have higher living standards than hedge fund manager friends of mine in London who've been working for 30 years. It's really extraordinary to see it. I mean, small but important details. For example, housing in Mississippi is sort of built in order to satisfy customers. So when I was a member of parliament in Clacton and developers wanted to build housing, there was tremendous resistance to it because invariably the type of housing they wanted to build was sort of monotonous and built because the authorities in the local planning department approved it. It was built, not designed to be pleasing to the would-be owner, but in order to tick the compliance boxes. Here in Mississippi, the design of housing is just quite extraordinary. How wonderful and lovely it is, and it's bizarre to live in a country where houses are affordable, and people have a standard of living that has improved significantly in the 4 years that I've been here. I don't want to crow about it, but I mean, if you want to stop Britain becoming a second or third world country, you are seriously going to have to look at places like Mississippi and ask why it is they're doing so well. And I think Britons need to make some pretty tough decisions about things like planning regulation, because it's, if you want to keep your green belt, great, keep your green belt, but you'll stay poor.
Yeah, I mean, we think so too. And we'd like to ask you about this manifesto of yours, though first I would like to know if there's anything you think Mississippi can learn from Britain.
Don't do yourself down too much. The UK has some phenomenal first-class universities. I mean, there's an Oxford, Mississippi with a great university in it, but I can't help but think that actually the Oxford back in England is still a world-class university. Cambridge is still a world-class university. Imperial and UCL, you've got some great universities there. If you make a list of the sort of top 10 universities around the world, almost all of them are in the Anglosphere and a lot of them are in the UK. 2 or 3 of them, maybe even 4 of them are in the UK. You've got the human capital there. You've got all the potential there. The question is, what can you do to remove the obstacles in the way? There's nothing inevitable about Britain being in the doldrums. There's nothing inevitable about stagnating growth and insanely expensive house prices. These are problems caused by bad public policy. So I do think the potential is there for the UK.
And this report that you've written, or this manifesto even for the Telegraph, to what extent has it been informed by your time in the States?
The default setting over here is towards freedom and liberty. A conservative here wouldn't have to accept the terms of the debate on things like taxation that you would necessarily have to accept, or until now you've had to accept in the UK. I have to say, though, I wrote Milestones partly out of a sense of sadness. I feel sad looking back at my country, Britain, and seeing it doing so badly. And I wanted to do something to try to encourage people who think the way I do in the UK, to discuss what can be done about it. So much of the discussion is soap opera. It's is it this leader or that leader? Is it going to be this party or that party? I actually wanted to put forward some concrete proposals. I also felt a sense of frustration because I wrote the paper because I felt that some of the people and institutions who should be thinking these things aren't doing it. The infrastructure of the liberty movement in Britain has never been better. There have never been more well-funded think tanks and initiatives. Where's the granular detail?
I think that was what I was really struck by, was just how granular it was. And we've been crying out for people to do what you have done and to go into granular detail and say, look, these are the laws, these are the acts, these are the decisions that need to be changed, amended, or removed, and lay out a roadmap.
I mean, I think in fairness, my slight detachment by being 4,000 miles away makes it perhaps ironically a bit easier to do that, because I can detach myself from the question of personality and I can think, okay, how are we going to fix this? What do we actually need to do? For me, the key moment came when I stopped and realized that actually Britain has had almost a sort of uniparty running it for 30 years. And at the beginning of Milestones, I set out a short, brief outline of Britain's problem. You've had essentially 28 years of Blairite governments. Blair, Gordon Brown, Boris Johnson, David Cameron, they're all essentially Blairites. And that is to say they all subscribe to the same centre-left assumptions. Number one, they believe in the infallibility of experts, which is why they've devolved public policy making decisions to organisations that are beyond public accountability. Tony Blair first did this by making the Bank of England independent, giving it the power to set interest rates and manage the economy and regulate the banks. They managed to tank the banks a decade ago and preside over runaway inflation. They did a disastrous job. Boris Johnson similarly devolved decision-making to a group of COVID experts who presided over a ruinous lockdown. The one thing all of the Blairite governments of the past 3 decades in Britain have in common is a tendency to give policy-making to experts. A second thing they all have in common is a belief that the free market somehow needs to be regulated, that it's imperfect and it requires oversight. And Britain does have a free market economy in the sense that the state doesn't own chunks of the economy, but the state nonetheless regulates so much of the economy that it might as well own vast chunks of what is notionally in the private space. And a third thing all these governments have in common is a belief that human nature is universal and that our rights as individuals come not from our traditions as an English-speaking peoples, but by governments signing up to various supranational charters and conventions. Fundamentally, if you believe that human nature is universal, if you believe that an Eritrean can become English and an Englishman can become Eritrean, you believe people are interchangeable. And this explains why you open up your borders and why you don't insist upon assimilation and why you allow the creation of parallel societies and communities to exist in the UK. We've had 30 years of this, and I would say it's the Blairite Ascendancy has been a disaster for the country. It's run the country into the ground. And I begin Milestones by setting this out and saying, we don't need a revolution. These guys are the revolutionaries. They have, through these centre-leftist assumptions, fundamentally overturned our way of life, to the point where they insist not only that people are interchangeable, but that a man can become a woman. This universalist, centre-leftist, Blairite nonsense is an assault on our way of life. We don't need a revolution, we need a restoration. We need to recognise that the governments we've had for 30 years have been a disaster, and we need to put it right. And once you see that, once you recognise it's not a question of Labour versus Tory or Tory versus Labour, but they've all been dreadful for 30 years, then you begin to see, okay, what is it we need to do to put things right? From that's where I then began to make a list of the 34 specific things that I think an incoming government needs to do to fix the country. Now, there may be others, but I went into quite a lot of detail. I didn't want to sort of say, wouldn't it be nice if? I wanted to actually say, here is a piece of legislation or a statutory instrument or an order in council. Here is the specific bill that needs to be passed in order to effect this change. And I'm really delighted with the reaction, actually. It's been very reassuring.
Well, what kind of reaction have you had?
I've had a phenomenal reaction. I mean, I knew that the Sunday Telegraph was going to run it. And I, occasionally have written things for newspapers in the UK and will get one or two people messaging me. But I got a sort of flood, a huge number of people online talking about it, discussing it, saying, gosh, this is exactly what's needed. Or some of them were saying, this wouldn't work because, and coming up with what they thought was a better idea. But that's the whole point. I want us to come up with a granular detail as to what we need to do. It's not just a list of policies, though. I don't think it's enough to come up with a list of policies. The reality is that the Blairite governments of the past 30 years have given so much power to the civil servants, the officials who run the country. So much power to a leftist activist judiciary who are a brake on the reforms we need. I wanted to set out a detailed program as to how we would implement change, not just what we wanted to see done, but how we would bring about change, how we would overcome the parasitic conservatism of the civil service class, of the officials, of what in Britain we call the quangocrats. A very, very positive reaction from lots of people on the centre right. So yeah, I'm very excited by it. So much so, in fact, that I'm coming back to the UK in a few weeks' time to discuss in a lot more detail with one or two people in Westminster who've reached out to say, could you elaborate on this?
Well, back in a blaze of glory, we're going to quiz you on some of the specific elements of milestones, and perhaps we can even winkle out of you who those figures in Westminster might be. Before we get into that, I will entreat the listeners to read the thing. I think on this podcast, as elsewhere, we talk a lot about things that we'd like to see Britain do, but those discussions often lack a plan as to restoring power to the executive, such that we can actually do these things again. That was one of the most exciting parts of milestones, I think. I'm going to hand over to Calum now to talk about the program that you outline.
Yeah, I think, Douglas, we were very struck, and we've been, well, I at least have been arguing against institutions like the OBR for a long time. And I think you were right that we've had a uni party, but it's also even outside of the uni party, even the people on the centre right have lost touch with those feelings and those instincts that should power or should motivate a right-wing, as you say, liberty-focused way of governing. I think first thing to talk about, is the ability of an incoming government to respond and counteract the restrictions and the blockers that the civil service and the judiciary would put on an ambitious and reforming and, as you say, repealing government. What do you see? I mean, I've read your paper, but maybe do you want to tell the listeners, what do you think the problems of the civil service are? Why is it that they are not following the will of the elected politicians, and then what can we do then to get past those obstacles?
Well, you mentioned the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility. Now, this was an institution set up. I mean, this is a classic illustration of the problem. The OBR, Office of Budget Responsibility, was set up by George Osborne in the belief that if you had an independent quango, an independent body that would sit in judgment of government tax and spend decisions, it would somehow lead to better decision-making. In fact, since the creation of the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, we have had chronic budget irresponsibility. We have blown billions of pounds on lockdowns. We have frittered away our children's tax returns on not very much. We have run up huge debts during the entire time that we've had the OBR. So far from putting disinterested experts in charge of something and getting better outcomes, what happened with the OBR shows that actually if you devolve decision-making to experts, you end up with worse decisions. Now, we've just had a spring statement in Britain where the government, elected by a big majority, put forward a tax and spend proposal. What is truly extraordinary is that the OBR de facto has the right to veto the tax and spend decisions made by our elected representatives. Now, we're getting to the nub of the problem because we've devolved decision-making to unaccountable experts on tax and spend, the OBR. We've done something similar with energy policy on the Climate Change Commission. We've done something very similar on immigration. One of the reasons why 1 in every 27 people in the UK is someone who's arrived in the country in the past 24 months is because we devolved to an advisory body on immigration the ability to decide how many visas we hand out. And unsurprisingly, they decided we should hand visas out like confetti. In area after area after area, devolving decisions to experts doesn't lead to better decisions. It leads to worse public policy making. And this is the root cause of the problem. So rather than just looking at the failures of tax and spend with the OBR, or energy policy with the Climate Change Commission, or immigration with the advisory body on immigration, or the Sentencing Council, I could go on. There's a sort of alphabet soup of these unaccountable institutions. We need to draw it up into a theme. How do we undo this unaccountable administrative state? Now, you might say, why is it that the administrative state is inherently bad at making decisions? Well, one reason is because they look at a narrow set of indices. The Bank of England looks at a narrow set of indices when setting inflation targets. The COVID, the committee that oversaw lockdowns looked at a narrow set of data on the trajectory of a virus. The Climate Change Committee looks at a narrow set of data on CO2 emissions. None of them look at the bigger picture. And none of them take the broader view as to what might be the best interests of society. So technocracy actually leads not to better government, it leads to disastrous government. I think there's also a problem that many of the people who serve on these unaccountable bodies have spent too long at university. And they have, like many overeducated people, an exaggerated sense of their ability to change the world and influence the world for the better. It's very tempting, Hayek was brilliant on this, to believe that if you are an expert, you can assemble enough information in one place to make decisions. The world is far more complicated than that. You can't. You cannot assemble in a single spot enough information to know the correct interest rates to control inflation or the correct response to limit the spread of a virus. The world is much more complicated than a technocrat can ever account for. And this, I think, is the root cause of the problem. You can be a very well-meaning, uber-intelligent PhD with lots and lots of data. You're never going to know enough to know how to do things right. So we need to recognize that this system of administration is inherently flawed. It's a really bad way of running a country. It's almost as bad as socialism. It's a sort of technocratic socialism, and it has ruined the UK in the space of a generation.
I think you make an interesting point there about the metrics. We've spent, Tom and I and some of our friends have spent over the last week a while talking about whether we should be focusing on GDP or GDP per capita. And the real conversation, or the real thought that came out of it was, this is a proxy for individual flourishing. What we want are Britons to be able to have the best lives that they possibly can. And even these proxies are bad. And the metrics that, as you say, your experts are using are proxies for proxies for proxies, and that maybe aren't even that well correlated at all. I think as well, this idea of them pursuing goals that are not necessarily in line with the benefit or the flourishing of the population is, for them it's a political decision, right? They have goals that they think actually the unwashed masses are too stupid to understand and should be pursued, even to the detriment of the people. I mean, net zero, I think, is a good example of that. But these experts have these blockers. How else? What can we do then to overcome them? What are the decisions, the concrete decisions that we need to make to overcome this resistance?
In Milestones, I set out 9 areas of reform, but the first one was to establish control over public administration, because winning an election is not enough. You can have a majority in parliament, but unless you are willing to take on and destroy, and I choose my words deliberately, destroy the Quango state, the administrative state, the Sir Humphreys, unless you treat them the way Margaret Thatcher treated the National Union of Mine Workers, as an enemy to be destroyed, unless you do that from the get-go, you will end up like Boris Johnson, being undermined by them. I know this from experience, because after Boris Johnson was elected, myself and a couple of others had produced an oven-ready plan to reform Whitehall and to reform Downing Street and to create a department of the Prime Minister. And the feeling very much amongst the victorious group around Boris was that there was no need to do this. It was a distraction. They needed to get on with governing and worry about Whitehall reform maybe a bit later. And I remember saying to some of them, look, if you don't establish control over the civil servants, there will be no second term, there will be no later. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. Boris Johnson was ousted by the Sir Humphreys, by the establishment, I think, for eating a birthday cake or not eating a birthday cake at a birthday party. Liz Truss was unceremoniously deposed after 40 days.
Well, and the civil servants are very proud, right, of their ability to have removed Liz Truss.
Yeah, and Sunak was sort of tolerated because he sort of like a sort of tame politician did what was expected of him. You've had for 15 years people voting for Conservative governments and not getting Conservative policy. This isn't going to change unless you prepare to come in there and do the following things. Number one, you need what are known as orders in council. This is a device that can be used using the Crown prerogative for the Prime Minister, when asked to form a government, to insist that the King approve, the Privy Council approve to certain changes, amongst which are the ability to remove senior civil servants, if need be, down to DG level, Director General level. There may also be a need for some emergency primary legislation to reform to overturn the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act of 2010. That would allow ministers to come in there and, number one, hire and fire civil servants, so that if civil servants, for example, like they did over the Rwanda scheme, just refused to implement it, or if they decided to go slow and not do something, or if they decided to ignore the ministerial wishes and cite some arcane piece of legislation as the basis for not doing what the minister wanted, they would be given a P45 and sacked that day. It would allow ministers to bring in outsiders, because part of the problem is that the civil service is a club. And if you join the club in your 20s, you get to hold senior positions 30 years later, no matter how useless you've been. We need to be able to bring in outsiders who aren't beholden to the club rules, who can actually run the civil service and make decisions. Look, if you're a minister in charge of a department with 10,000 employees and you can't sack or hire and fire more than 3 or 4 of them, you're not in charge of that department. That department's in charge of you. This is why ministers end up being in office but not in power. They sit in their office and they jab at buttons that don't work. They pull at levers that have been disconnected. To change that, you need to give ministers the power to hire and fire people in their own department. You need orders in council to do this. The second thing you need to do is to radically change the triumvirate of dysfunction at the heart of the British administrative state. At the moment, you've got number 10 Downing Street, the Cabinet Office, and the Treasury. Why do we have 3 departments? It's a recipe for chaos. It suits the civil servants. It allows performance to be ignored. It allows for non-delivery. Every government since Tony Blair has actually struggled with this issue of delivery. The Prime Minister will make a speech, demand something is done, and it never gets done. Why? Because you've got this triumvirate of dysfunction. In place of that, you need a department of the Prime Minister. And in Milestones, I go into quite a lot of detail about the 7 or 8 different specific functions that you would need to have in a department of the Prime Minister. It would allow the Prime Minister, the executive fiat, to drive forward changes and oversee outcomes and control public spending. That's a key one. The way things are set up at the moment, there's no real... imagine when you go out with friends in the evening and you decide that you're going to split the tab 10 ways, and everyone has an incentive to eat and drink as much as they want because they know that whatever they order, they're only going to pick up 1/10 of the cost. Now, that's fine when you're going out with friends, but it's no way to set the budget for a whole country. That's in effect what we do now. We don't have a single entity at the center like they do in Ireland or Australia overseeing what return are we getting for this spending in this department. So the Department of the Prime Minister could do that. And I think you would begin to get much better bang for your buck. So orders in council to establish control of the civil service, the creation of a department of the Prime Minister. You also need, I think, to recognize that the judiciary is going to be a big problem. So I outline in Milestones specific steps that you need to take to rein in judicial review and to make sure that judges can no longer do what they now routinely do, which is to strike down legislation that they personally don't think is agreeable. You need to address this, and I set out how to do that in Milestones in quite a lot of detail.
Yeah, and I think I think we have a lot of sympathy with that because we feel this great frustration, as you say, about the lack of delivery. But I think in the country there is a fear that the politicians themselves are not very capable, and that this has allowed civil servants to assume more powers as a way of keeping the country safe, a steady pair of hands. I personally think that leads as well, as you say, it's no one is responsible, so no one takes responsibility, so bad decisions are made.
Absolutely, and politics therefore becomes rather performative. If I may say, in the Tory party in particular, which I know well, but I think also in the Labour Party, you've had 20 or 30 years of elevating people as basically diversity hires. Now, I'm not saying that everyone who doesn't fit the sort of stereotypical white middle class male politician, I'm not saying everyone who doesn't fit that is a diversity hire.
You can have useless white men as well.
Totally, and there are plenty of those. But you've had a lot of diversity hires in politics. You've also had a lot of useless, middle-aged, lazy white males. You've not had a very meritocratic system for selecting people in winnable seats and elevating people in those backbench positions to the front bench and then into positions of executive authority in government. So you've ended up with a lot of dross, both in Labour and Conservative governments. And so what happens is, and I've seen this, the minister literally walks into their department, chuffed with themselves for being whatever it is, Home Secretary or Foreign Secretary or Minister for Widgets or whatever. And they're then absolutely clueless as to what they want to do. And they basically spend their time with their spads working out how they can get social media following or how they can generate press coverage. They have absolutely no idea as to what it is they want to do. And some of them actually, in deference to the civil servants, some of them are actually pathetically grateful when the civil servants come along and say, well, Minister, these are some ideas. And this is why so often, no matter who's in charge, notionally, as a minister, we often end up with the same policies being pursued because the minister is essentially clueless. They don't know what to do. And the civil servants and the department end up trying to do what they think needs to be done.
I think you're right in that there's been a vast vacuum of initiative and ideas, and this body has, and I think they feel quite aggrieved about some of this criticism now because they would say, well, we've been keeping the show on the road just about.
Let me give you a couple of specific examples. I mean, we see the Boris wave migrants, where 2.5 million migrants were allowed into the country in a very short space of time. Well, who was Prime Minister? Boris Johnson. Who was Home Secretary? Priti Patel. Was Priti Patel even aware of what was going on? Somewhat doubtful. We've seen James Cleverly, not very cleverly sometimes, the former foreign minister, criticize the decision to hand over the Chagos Islands by Keir Starmer. Well, who was minister when this idea got off the ground? One James Cleverly. Now, you have to ask yourself, is this entirely because wicked Sir Humphrey is plotting in the background? Now, there may be an element of that. A lot of people in the Foreign Office have leftist ideas and assumptions, and I frankly don't trust some of the civil servants who I know were architects of the deal, and I certainly don't trust some of those in the Home Office who or their views on immigration. But I think you have to also recognize the sheer vacuousness of some of the ministers who allowed some of this to be done in their name. So Milestones is certainly a proposal to establish control over public administration, but you need people with the character and the wherewithal and the intellect to come in and drive the changes and the policies that they want to see driven. So, you need to establish control, but you need to know where you're going with that control at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I was sort of aware of this, but I think seeing it written down was quite sobering for me, was that at the moment, ministers don't have the right to issue binding directives to officials. That you cannot hope to do anything. You cannot hope to run a large, complicated organization if, as you say, you're operating through so many layers of veils, of gauzes, of polite fictions.
And a lot of this is because of the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act of 2010. And it means you end up in the absurd situation where someone like Dominic Raab, who is now an ex-minister and an ex-politician, but I think was actually in some ways quite a good foreign secretary, he got into trouble for using hearty words to civil servants who wouldn't do what he damn well told them. Well, in the real world, those civil servants would have been fired that afternoon. Instead, you end up with this Kafkaesque world in which a minister, frustrated because of the failure of the people around him to do what they're being asked to do, and they've got a series of laws they can point to. And in the Middle Ages, there was a dynasty called the Merovingians, and they basically became useless and were taken over by their palace servants, the Carolingians. You see something very similar at the moment. The elected people are basically performative. They are effete and weak, and they sit limply on the throne with real power in the hands of the officials behind them. And the officials behind them are devious and incompetent. It's why the country's in a mess.
So let's go through. We've established the the lay of the land and the swamp, so to speak. Let's lay out what a day one looks like. You've mentioned the orders of council. You've got some of your acts, so the British Sovereignty Act, the Free Speech Act. Let's talk about some of the real material nuts and bolts.
I mean, the choice you asked earlier as to what extent I've been influenced by what's happening in America. I mean, the choice really for the centre right in Britain is, when they come in, are they going to be rather like Trump 1.0, where they intend to do things, but there's chaos and they don't really achieve much? Or are they going to be like Trump 2.0, where whether you like him or hate him, Trump in his second term has been remarkably good at choreographing the actions he needs to do to change the system around him? Now, I emphasize this, whether you agree with Trump or not, Trump 2.0 has been far, far better organized than Trump 1.0. Milestones is an attempt to give a reformist government the option for being like Trump 2.0, not the first Trump term. I hope it gives the script. I'm not quite sure who's going to be cast as the lead actors in this play, but I hope that Milestones provides a script for them to follow and a strategy for them to follow. So step one are these orders in council. You need some emergency legislation as well. You then need a whole draft of legislation to tackle the judiciary. To preempt judicial review, to allow the Lord Chancellor to remove from the bench judges who adjudicate on the basis of what they want the law to be rather than what it is. Now, you need to be careful in doing that, but you undoubtedly need to do it. You'll get a certain type of Tory MP who will say that's not the British way. Well, neither are activist judges the British way, but if you want to see a conservative Britain, you need to be prepared to remove activist judges. You also need... there's a lot of talk in Britain at the moment on the right about a great repeal bill, rather. I think it's true that a lot of the legislation that the Blairite Ascendancy has passed over the past 30 years, well-intended, has had really disastrous consequences. And you need to get rid of a lot of it. You need to repeal the Equalities Act. You need to repeal, I think, Section 127 of the Communications Act, which inhibits free speech. You need to repeal the Climate Change Act. You need to get rid of the Supreme Court. The Equalities Act overturns the idea that people in Britain are equal under the law. The Equalities Act, combined with human rights legislation and the HRA, the Human Rights Act, basically creates a system of law in Britain in which if you have protected characteristics, immutable characteristics, you are treated better than a person without those protected characteristics. And this means that in Britain, in England, the land of the English, white Britons are now treated less favourably than people with protected characteristics. This is a perversion of the idea of equality before the law. There is, thanks to this legislation, a requirement on all public bodies to discriminate against white British people in their own country. This is an outrage, and it needs to go. You need to overturn the Equalities Act, I believe, with a meritocracy act that will make it simply illegal to discriminate against anyone, either so-called positively or negatively, on the basis of race.
Well, and this is what people think the Equalities Act does, right? That's the slightly dystopian nature of the name, is that in repealing the Equalities Act, in order to pursue equality, one is cast as someone doing the very opposite. Okay, so and then what about the Supreme Court? Why are we getting rid of the Supreme Court?
The Supreme Court was created in 2005 by the Blairite Ascendancy, who I think looked across the Atlantic and thought, wouldn't it be nice to have a Supreme Court? And a lot of the people on the left, like Keir Starmer, are basically sort of activist lawyers. And they like the idea of empowering the judiciary, giving the judiciary more and more power. Now, the British judiciary always used to be rather self-restrained. The British legal tradition was always that judges should try to adjudicate on the basis of what the law said and on the basis of common law, and they shouldn't be inventive and creative. They put this aside with the creation of a Supreme Court. And I think this reached a height with the attempt by the Supreme Court to actually decide whether or not it was lawful for Parliament, which makes our laws, to dissolve itself. You've had this sort of chronic judicial overreach by the judges. And it means today that it's almost impossible for us to elect a government that can control our borders or police our borders or remove the hundreds of thousands of people in the UK who've come in illegally. That needs to go too. And we need to return to the idea that the Lord Chancellor, accountable ultimately to Parliament, oversees judicial appointments and, in effect, polices the judiciary.
I think you're onto something there about the activist judges and also the unwillingness of people who should know better to protect these rights that, yes, come from our island history and our island heritage. Speaking to someone fairly high up in the Tory party last weekend, who, when I mentioned that we should be removing activist judges, said, my dear boy, we are the Conservative Party, and that is not conservative. As you say, this is an organisation that came into being in 2005. This is a return, not any kind of revolution.
The Conservative Party's institutional acceptance up until now of the Blairite Ascendancy, the way they've accepted all of these Blairite bits of legislation, it explains why there is now a Reform Party. It explains why the Conservative Party has lost its market share. Now, the Conservative Party either needs to recognise that it should stand in opposition to and repudiate the Blairite inheritance, this toxic legislative legacy of the Blairites. It either does that or it becomes extinct. It's a simple choice. The Human Rights Act was incorporated, or rather the Human Rights Act incorporated the European Convention on Human Rights into UK law. Now, the European Convention on Human Rights is a vaguely worded, well-meaning charter brought in after the Second World War, largely in response to some of the grotesque abuses that happened in Nazi-occupied Europe. The problem is that it allows British judges to adjudicate on the basis of a very vaguely worded document, and it allows them to basically stipulate that the law means whatever it is they want it to mean. The idea of a British Sovereignty Act is to say that no longer stands. We leave the ECHR, and British judges adjudicate on the basis of either the common law. I love the idea that actually the common law, rather than statutory law, informs a lot of judicial decisions. They adjudicate either on the basis of English common law or on the basis of what the statute actually says. And pretty much that's it. No supranational charters on which to decide what public policy in Britain is.
Yeah, and then one that I know our listeners will be delighted to see on the list is the Planning Deregulation Act. Will this get us, Douglas, our vast Mississippian houses?
Planning regulation in the UK, a lot of conservative-minded people above the age of 60 really like the idea of preserving the Greenbelt. But you've got a choice. If you want to keep that planning restriction, great, okay. Keep that planning restriction and you will stay poor. We need to get rid of a lot of that planning regulation and remove a lot of the restrictions that basically say that when you build new housing, you have to have a certain segment of the new development for affordable housing. You need to deregulate the planning codes so that architects design houses like they do in America that people want to live in, rather than ones that conform with what the regulator says must be built.
Are you proposing that we get rid of B bricks?
Pretty much, yeah.
Incredibly radical, Douglas.
But why not? I mean, look at countries that don't have this regulatory code. They have places that are beautiful. They have houses that are affordable, and they have young people under the age of 30 who stand a chance of being able to own a property. I know lots of people under the age of 30 in Britain who can only really afford a property if they either live somewhere they wouldn't want to live, or they're fortunate enough to have parents or grandparents who can help them out. Since when was it a good idea to become a sort of hereditary property owning system? It's not a surprise that young people are moving to the left if they can't become capital owning free marketeers. One of the great changes of the Thatcher government was to give ordinary people the ability to own property. We have to change these regulations, and it's urgent and essential that we do it.
I think you mentioned people moving to the left. I think there's a there's an interesting phenomenon that has taken place over the last 80 to 100 years, maybe even no longer than that. I would probably put it 160 years, which is that as the gains of economic growth have not been fully ploughed back into better living standards, but rather into reducing the amount of hours that people have worked. There was a statistic I saw that, now 20 people on average will spend 20% of their life in retired, claiming a pension. We've seen movements to reduce the number of days that people would spend at work down to four days a week. There's an interesting phenomenon here where people don't necessarily seem to understand the benefits that growth would bring, or rather actually would prefer to just spend less time working.
I don't think this is a bad thing. I mean, actually, I think you've hit on a really important point. As we become more productive, it's possible to work fewer hours and have the same standard of living. And that's why the number of hours we work every year has fallen. I think we see this in everyday life. Often when women have children, not all women, but I know a number of women who've had children and they thought they were going to go back to work. They decide that actually, no, they would rather and find it more fulfilling to be a full-time mum than go back to work and have a notionally higher standard of living from having the second income. I don't think it's a bad thing that we have the flexibility to decide, particularly with the gig economy, that you can perhaps have more leisure time and not work every hour that you want to. And the weekend itself, the idea of Saturday being a day of rest, is quite a new idea in the past sort of 100 years or so. I suspect that we're going to see, as we get this explosion of productivity, which is certainly happening in the United States, we're going to see people in effect have 3-day weekends. We're going to see more and more people decide to dip in and out of work and not work 37 hours. I don't think that's a bad thing, though.
I think the last thing that I'd like to talk about is the idea of, is it actually the difficulty of maintaining a small state? It has seemed throughout the history of the 20th century that the state has grown inexorably larger as appeals have been made that the government must do something about something. I've just been writing about the building of the sewers in London in the 19th century. And what is very striking there is, as the government becomes more effective and more capable, the calls for it to do more and to fix problems for its people become ever louder. You know, the line is that Cthulhu always swims to the left. Is there a way that we can have a restrained state that doesn't accrete responsibilities and doesn't grow larger, almost, as people said about the British Empire, through a fit of absence of mind?
I think there are two real drivers for the growth of the state in the West, and they're often under commented on. I don't think democracy is inherently expansive. I don't buy this idea that in a democracy people will inevitably vote for more and more public spending. I think two key changes happened in Britain, specifically in the 1930s. Up until, I think it was 1931, I may have got that wrong, it might have been 1932. Up until then, Parliament basically controlled the budget. There was a change to the standing orders of the House of Commons that meant that individual backbenchers could no longer table amendments to the budget in the 1930s. And once that happened, the budget became a discussion entirely between the two front benches. And so there was no real scrutiny of what it was the government was planning on doing in terms of raising taxes and what it was planning on doing with that revenue and how it was planning on spending. And so budget day from that moment on became largely performative, to the point where when I was a member of Parliament, no one on the benches around me had the first clue as to what was being proposed in terms of tax and spending. They had to wait and watch the evening news to get the BBC's distorted vision of what was being done. So you've had a similar process in America too, where Congress used to set the budget, and there used to be a unified committee structure that would oversee what the executive was planning on spending with taxpayers' money. That was changed in the 1930s in America so that different committees, an agricultural committee will set the agriculture budget, the defense committee will set the defense budget. And because there's no unified oversight, each of these committees has a vested interest in setting the budget higher and higher and higher. So one thing you need to do if you really want to control public spending is to give the legislatures in the West the control over tax and spending that they had until the 1930s. It's no coincidence that you've had the great growth of government since the 1930s. It wasn't fundamentally the Second World War or the New Deal that changed things. It was the loss of control over the power of the purse strings in the House of Commons and the US Congress that led to this explosion. There's a second thing that happened. Until 1971, there was a link between the currency and the gold standard. And what that basically meant is that there was a restriction on the amount of currency that the US government and by extension the governments of the West through Bretton Woods could create. Since 1971, you've had our currency is in 100% fiat currency, paper money, a monopoly money. And what that's basically meant is that governments don't need to worry about taxation when it comes to spending. They can borrow through the bond market whatever it is they want to spend money on. They can promise voters that they're going to keep taxes low, but spend more because the voters are never going to have to face the tax consequences of those spending decisions thanks to the bond market. The bond market has literally filled the gap between tax and spend. You ultimately need to give the legislative branch of government control over the issuance of government bonds. Because at the moment, the real tax and spend decisions are not being made by the legislature when it decides to increase or lower tax. The real tax and spend decisions are being made by those officials in Whitehall who decide how many bonds the government should issue. So give back control of the legislature tax and spend decisions and give legislative oversight over the issuing of government debt. That is the only way you can ultimately limit the growth of government in the West.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not just a question of giving back control, but it's also a giving back of responsibility, isn't it? It's that unless the members of parliament feel responsible for the country and that they don't feel that they can load up debt that will then be paid for by taxpayers that are after which, when they have left Parliament, they won't feel this responsibility to take care.
One of the most striking things anyone on social media will be aware of is the extent to which Elon Musk has come in and uncovered this extraordinary misuse of not millions, but billions of dollars of American taxpayer money. It was going on Bondoogles, on the most outrageous scams. Why was USAID giving money in effect to Mayor Khan in London? You've had these extraordinary, some of it was probably illegal, but a lot of it was certainly indefensible. Why wasn't Congress doing this? This is what I find so extraordinary about Doge. Doge is looking at waste in government. What are all those senators and congressmen doing? What have they been doing? Now, if you push some of those senators and congressmen, they'll say, well, we can't control spending because a lot of it is non-discretionary. Excuse me? It's all discretionary. You fought a war against the British on the principle of no taxation without representation to make absolutely certain that all government spending is discretionary, and you are in charge of deciding at whose discretion that money is spent. You've been asleep at the wheel for a generation. That, I think, is the real lesson of Doge. If Doge can uncover that much misappropriation of public money in America, think of what all of those MPs in the House of Commons, if they were doing their job properly, might be able to uncover in Britain. No one is ever seeing this stuff at the moment. No one.
I think you're bang on there about people having this great sense, and this, I think, was what we talk about on the Anglo-Futurism podcast, that politicians have broken this link with their history and thus don't appreciate the sacrifices and the battles that were fought to protect these rights that they now trample over and ignore.
I mean, I know what it's like being a member of Parliament. For 12 years, I sat in the House of Commons and I was surrounded often by people, not all of them, but many people who basically their prime interest was to sit in their office in the House of Commons with the debate in the House of Commons on the TV behind them, not taking any part in it, figuring out what press release they could issue to make themselves look like they were important in the eyes of their constituents, and that performative activity is the main part of most MPs' job. That's why we're in the mess we're in.
We've heard that Cthulhu swims left, but I've also heard that he swims towards a cup of tea. So whilst we go and follow him in that direction, we will leave you listeners with a few words from our sponsors.
Are you a stout English Martian colonist? Are you missing the taste of home? Then try the new Fairbrother Martian Pale Ale today. This unique ale, brewed as God intended it, using autonomously harvested Kentish hops, brings you a taste of home to your hab. Our master brewers have spent decades designing the perfect flavour that will transport you back to the flat-roofed pub you had your first drink in. The ale is further improved by the journey from Earth, by the high G forces that it experiences during acceleration and deacceleration, and the mild radiation from the Hawking engines gives it its unique kick. If you like Fairbrother MPA, it also comes in a children's variety, packed with all the important vitamins and minerals crucial for growing bones and thyroids. Order a sample keg of Fairbrother Mild. Your wife will thank you.
Listeners, welcome back. We are here with Douglas Carswell in the KC3, and here in the second half of the podcast, we will start with the other elements of milestones, such as Douglas's shock therapy for the economy. Douglas, could you give us an overview of the economic treatments you want to give Britain?
We need to do three things. We need to allow growth by radical deregulation. That means getting rid of the planning restrictions. It means doing a thorough audit of the 19,000 regulations we inherited residually from being in the EU. We shouldn't get rid of all of those. It might in some cases be sensible to not change things, but I think there are many of those regulations that could be removed. I can think of a couple off the top of my head, but there are many of the 19,000, particularly on data protection, I think, where we need to get rid of what we inherited from being in the EU. You need, I think, also to address taxation. Now, before you come on to the issue of tax cuts, you need to control public spending. At the moment, the UK, about 45% of GDP is government spending. When Tony Blair came into office, it was about 37%. You should aim, I think, to be a successful country to get it down to about 33, 34%. Now, you can't do that overnight. The first step should be to get it from 45% back to where it was pre-COVID, 40%. You can do that in the term of a parliament. I outline in milestones the 170 billion of tax cuts you need to do that. Sadly, for people on the right, you cannot do this simply by abolishing foreign aid. You can eliminate most foreign aid, although I do think you need a couple of billion spare for humanitarian relief, but you can do things like get rid of 8 out of the 24 government departments. That would save you 30 billion a year. You can, I think, take a hatchet job to a lot of the welfare programs that we now have in Britain that have ballooned over the past few years, so much so that people who go out to work are being taxed to support an army of people who aren't going out to work. So I think you need welfare reform. You need to, like Argentina's President Milei, to dramatically cut the number of government departments. I outline how you do that for 8 of the 24 government departments. It's difficult, though, to cut spending, but it can be done. There's no magic formula to do it. Some of it will involve honest conversations with people who are going to lose their benefits, and you have to have that conversation and you have to do it. Once you've worked out how to cut government spending by 170 billion, you then, I think, can talk seriously and credibly about tax cuts. Now, I come up with a proposal for 70 billion worth of tax cuts in the first term of a parliament. I think you can do this sensibly. Number one, I think you can eliminate all tariffs overnight. Now, President Trump is busily increasing tariffs in America. I think we should respond by actually abolishing tariffs and doing so unilaterally. Tariffs in Britain only raised the government about 5 billion a year out of the 835 billion of tax revenue they collect. So it's a relatively small sum, but it's a big deal for households who have to pay higher prices on imported goods. So it would give an instant boost to British households if you got rid of tariffs. The next thing you need to do is address income tax. It's insane that people in Britain on modest incomes are paying 40% tax. How do you do that? Well, in Mississippi, we have a flat tax, income tax, which we're about to get rid of entirely. You can't do anything quite dramatic as that in the UK, but I think you should try and do it as follows. You should eliminate the 45% tax bracket because doing so is revenue neutral. Taxing people the 45% doesn't bring in any extra revenue. Get rid of that straight away. Then you can raise from about 50,000 the threshold on the 40% bracket. You can do that in the space of a parliament from 50,000 to incomes on 57,000. I think you should ultimately aim to raise that 40% threshold to incomes above 100,000. And I think you can do that incrementally. That would cost you, I think off the top of my head, about 30 billion in foregone revenue. I think you should cut corporation tax down from 25% to 15%. And again, I outline how you can do that incrementally over a 5-year term. VAT was brought in at 8% when we joined the European Union as a condition of being in the European Union. It's now a ruinous 20%. I think you need to reduce that down incrementally back down to 15% and ultimately make it a local sales tax, not a VAT, which is charged at every point of the supply chain, but a final point of sale local sales tax. And again, I outline in quite a lot of detail as to how you would do that in milestones. So you need to reiterate 3 things: radical deregulation, controlling public spending, which crowds out the private sector at the moment, and tax cuts. If you do that, you will start to see growth. And if you start to see growth, this is the miracle of compound interest rates, the miracle of compound growth. If you begin to generate growth from the anemic 1% that's projected at the moment, it becomes a virtuous circle. The more growth you have, the higher than expected your tax revenue, the more you can channel that surplus revenue, exactly as they've done in Mississippi, into further tax cuts. And you create this vicious upward spiral, this virtuous upward spiral. But it's going to be difficult. You need a 5-year parliament to kickstart it, and it will be painful.
Well, I fear you're going to run into trouble because there's this huge proportion of people who have become used to living off the state in some capacity, whether they work for the state, we have a balloons private sector, of course, or whether they're one of these huge mass of people in this country who live off disability payments. And this is not to say they're all fakers, of course, but there are lots of people who are very used to money from the state. Surely this requires a form of cultural engineering to wean people, if it is even possible, off these payments.
I was having a conversation with a Tory MP, or former Tory MP, I'm glad to say he was a former Tory MP, who was saying that, this would lead to a backlash. Yeah, of course, but you don't win these fights unless you fight them. You don't advance unless you put a step forward. You're going to have to fight this. It's going to be tough. You're going to be demonized. You're going to be vilified by the establishment residue media. Every time there is a decision that solicits some sympathy, it will be televised and thrown in your face. But you have to do it. It's either that or you become a third world country. The sooner this is done, the better. It will be difficult. It will require fortitude and resolution. But if you are claiming to be on the centre right and you're not prepared to balance the books, then you're not really on the centre right. You're part of the problem. Like in the 1970s, we need to make a decision. Do we want to be a serious country where people are wealthier, in the next generation is wealthier than the current generation? Or do you want to become a country where wealth is largely hereditary and the only people who can own houses are either people who get them through the government handout system or people who inherit them from their grandparents? I think there's no other choice. You've got to grit your teeth and have this fight. If you have a majority, a lot of the things that I outline need to be done early, because if you take the tough medicine and remove people who shouldn't be on welfare from welfare, initially there will be a lot of pain and a lot of howling, but ultimately, actually, they will be leading, by the time of the next election, more fulfilling lives. If you have the 2-year cap on employing anyone in the public sector and a 2-year cap on any wage increase in the public sector, you will see people furious with you for the first couple of years, but they will then leave their unfulfilling jobs where they're not really adding value or living purposeful lives, and go off and do something where they are living more purposeful lives. You have to be prepared to do this. You have to be prepared to do it quickly, and you have to hope that within 5 years, the medicine has worked and people can see the results. Thatcher did this rather brilliantly. She never lost an election because she always front-loaded the difficult decisions at the beginning of her first 5-year term. And I outline how to do this in milestones.
Yes, I think it's disastrous for Labour that they didn't do this at the beginning. They seemed unready for government. Only now are they addressing this kind of crisis in the size of the welfare bill. They haven't even got onto planning, which of course people are going to kick off about as well.
Yeah. I mean, they're inching towards it. I mean, what is so frustrating is to see Labour, by mathematics, having to end up doing some of this stuff, but doing it incompetently and badly and in half-hearted measures. I suspect that, actually it'll be good news for reformers, because Starmer will get a lot of the blame for supposed cuts without actually making effective cuts. And I think that will create the space for a reformist government, a restorationist government, to come in and make really big changes. But you've got to be prepared to do this at scale. You have to knock, PPI payments. You have to be prepared to knock billions off that. You have to be prepared to say to people living at public expense in government houses, you're not going to carry on doing that. And there will be howls of protest. But you need to do it.
There are some people we talk to who are fans of big sovereign projects for prosperity, like a sovereign AI project, or bringing in loads of nuclear power stations, that sort of thing. They think through this kind of state-backed project, we can raise prosperity in perhaps a less painful way than cutting the welfare bill. What do you make of that kind of argument?
How's the Alan Turing Institute doing?
Well, for listeners who are not aware, the Alan Turing Institute has been absolutely panned recently for contributing nothing. The account, as far as I'm aware, is that they were very uninterested in LLMs. And lo and behold, LLMs are by far the most important development in AI recently. And the Turing seems like a waste of tens of millions of pounds.
Yeah, on the flip side of that, we have Aria, right? Which uses a very different model and has been fated as a highly effective distributor of government money for high risk, high reward investment, right? I think the argument here is that industrial energy prices are one of these things that are really stopping us from manufacturing, and that it will take a government to change that calculus. What do you make of that?
You could look at the French government, right? In the Authors to Foundations paper, basically point out that in France, you can get away with all kinds of ridiculous socialist carry-on because they've got the foundations correct with nuclear power, cheap energy, childcare, good infrastructure in the form of trains. Maybe you can just muddle through and keep giving people BMWs if they have ADHD, just as long as you have enough power stations.
And how's that government debt doing? I mean, where is the French computer company Bull today? Where is French innovation? I think if you want to emulate France, I mean, there are certain things that France has got right. I think nuclear power, absolutely. Nuclear power would be affordable and feasible if it wasn't so heavily regulated. And in milestones, I come out with some specific proposals. There's a whole new generation of nuclear power plants. I mean, I'm grossly exaggerating, but basically the technology that allows you to have a nuclear reactor on a submarine can now be produced at scale, so that you can have lots of these little nuclear reactors everywhere. And indeed, Mississippi has commissioned a couple of these. And I think they're going to sort of rather change how we look at nuclear power. But one of the reasons why there's been so little innovation in the nuclear industry is because it's so heavily regulated. It's incredibly expensive because of regulation. If we removed a lot of the restrictions and did some of the things I suggest in milestones, you could have nuclear power play an increasing role in the UK, and the sooner the better. But, in the manner of a broken clock being right twice a day, the French do occasionally get something right. I don't think they're a great model, though. Where are the great French tech companies? Where are the great French universities?
Well, Mistral.
It's not. It's hardly. It's not world leading though, is it? Right?
No. I certainly wouldn't go into bat for the French kind of technology sector.
I think Europe overall, actually, EU Europe overall, shows how not to organise a society. It's run. I'm a Brexiteer. It's one of the things I believe passionately, that the European Union is a catastrophe for Europe. If you try to order society by top-down technocratic design, you stifle it, you destroy its innovation. And again and again and again, you hear European politicians say they're going to bring in a blueprint to make Europe more competitive. They've been saying this for a generation. Maybe it's the European-wide blueprints that are the problem. Don't have a blueprint. If Elon Musk had moved not from South Africa to the United States, but from South Africa to Belgium or South Africa to Croydon, I don't think he would be running an electric car company or sending manned missions to Mars or creating low Earth orbit satellites that have revolutionized communication around the world. I think he'd probably be working for local government or in the local bureaucracy. That is the root cause of Europe's problem.
Yes, I think we clearly have much more to learn from the Americans than the Europeans in this economic regards. And one of the other parts of milestones that stood out was the part on immigration and specifically remigration, which is not a word that people will have heard very often up till fairly recently. Could you give us an idea of how important you think that part of milestones is relative to the rest?
I'm talking to you from the United States, and I think there is something rather wonderful about people, I mentioned Elon Musk earlier, moving to a different country and making a success of it. And there are some benefits to that kind of migration. But that is the exception these days, I'm afraid. Most migration into Europe are not doctors and engineers and future Elon Musks coming in. Often they are people who are essentially welfare dependent, often very, very low skilled, coming in from low human capital societies, bringing with them the values that make those societies low human capital, unwilling to assimilate or integrate, with poor time preferences, impulsive behavior, and a high propensity to live on welfare and commit crime. And this is not just me saying this, the data says it. If you look at data from Denmark and the Netherlands, you have this extraordinary analysis done in the Netherlands where they show the net fiscal contribution made by migrants from different backgrounds. Migrants from the Anglosphere and to some extent East Asia are a huge benefit to the Netherlands. Migrants from other European countries are a benefit, not a huge benefit, but a benefit to the Netherlands. Migrants from Muslim majority countries are at no point in their lives net contributors to the economy or the exchequer in the Netherlands. Now, it's not simply a case of pounds and pence or euros and guilders or whatever it is in the Netherlands. If you look at data from Denmark, people, second generation Danish-born migrants from Middle Eastern and sub-Saharan African countries have a shockingly high propensity to have committed offences by the time they're 30. You bring with you, if you allow large-scale settlement in the West from Muslim countries, issues of cultural compatibility. Now, I would put it to you that if you believe in Sharia law, if you believe that someone who commits apostasy is guilty of a crime and should be put to death, if you believe that it was legitimate for Hamas to murder people in Israel because they were Jewish, you are not going to become a successful citizen of the West, and you shouldn't remain in the West, and you should be removed from the West. I don't think this should be controversial. So I come up in milestones with a series of proposals as to how you would, number one, stop further immigration from low capital, incompatible countries. And I think some of this can be done by orders in council straight away. You also then, I think, need legislation to create a system of voluntary remigration for people who have moved to the West from Muslim majority countries and want to go back. Sweden is already doing this. It shouldn't be controversial. I think you then need a system of automatic deportation for people who come into the country legally or illegally and commit serious offences, which I define in milestones as a prison sentence of more than 3 months. Given the state of our leftist judiciary, you probably have to commit a pretty serious offence to be committed for that length of time in the first place.
Or a naughty tweet.
Yeah, or say something with hurty words that leftist judges, because they're arbitrary and unfair, don't like.
Well, and there's a risk, right, that the Sentencing Council is trying to reduce the penalties for being an illegal immigrant way down as well. So, there's a risk that even that metric is not necessarily going to be met.
But then I think you need to do two further things. I think you need to look at people who are lawfully in the UK, who've come into the country but are net non-contributors. I hesitate to use the word spongers, but net non-contributors who live for prolonged periods on welfare or in social housing. Now, I'm not talking about someone who's fallen ill. I mean, if you live in a country and you've fallen ill or something beyond your control has happened, fair enough. But if you have come in from a third world country, a particularly Muslim majority country, and I think we should make that distinction, and you are basically sponging off the Attlee created British welfare system, I think there should be a test. And if you fail the test, you should be removed. You should be asked to leave. I don't think we should hesitate to do this. I don't have any moral qualms about doing this. Since when was our country and our welfare system built for your convenience and leisure? It's not. If you want to sponge off it, you must leave. I then think we need, and perhaps most controversially, an amendment to the British Nationality Act of 1981. Already that gives the British government the power to strip citizenship from someone. This could be someone born in Britain. Just because you're born in Britain, it doesn't automatically entitle you to stay British if you believe in things that are incompatible with British values and British culture. If you adhere to radical Islam, if you believe in Sharia law, if you believe, I think the key test is apostasy. There's a lot of evidence that Muslims living in the West, left to their own devices, abandoned the faith in significantly large numbers. And this actually makes sense when you think about it. Why would someone want to go through a forced marriage? Why would someone living in the West, with all the cultural values and influences of the greatest civilization the world has ever known around them, not want to integrate with that civilization? It's the attitude towards apostasy that prevents this happening at scale. So if you make attitudes towards apostasy a key litmus test and deport people and imams who preach punishment for apostasy, I think this is a key part of tackling the problem. If you do this, I think, begin to create an incentive for people who come to the UK to assimilate and become British to do rather well. People who don't want that and who want to live according to Sharia law, well, that's great. Go live Sharia law in a Muslim majority country. Now, why are we having this conversation, which would have been unthinkable a few years ago? Well, first of all, the leftist media controlled the narrative until very recently. I couldn't have, and you couldn't have posted a video that said these sort of things on social media until Elon Musk took over Twitter. We're seeing the democratization of opinion forming. And what this allows is not just specific granular discussions about what changes to what British legislation is needed. It allows us to address two underlying problems. It allows us to tackle head-on the leftist establishment and the cultural elites' adherence to cultural relativism. In Britain, for 30 or 40 years, we've all had to go along with the fiction that all cultures and all people are the same, and they're not. Some cultures are better at sending manned missions to Mars. Some cultures are better at inventing things and creating an elevated standard of living and a morally superior way of life. And some cultures are better at creating the sort of horrific abuses we saw in Rotherham. Now, this needs to be said, and it is going to be said, and until they shut down social media, we will be allowed to say this. Not all cultures are the same. And once you recognize that, you then, I think, stop having to defer to the idea that we must defer to other cultures in Britain.
Well, I think even more fundamentally, even if our culture was not superior, that had produced Shakespeare, produced Milton, Galton, the great scientists of history, but also it is our culture, and thus has preference just by that right.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I had a conversation with Carl Benjamin, who was sort of persona non grata in polite society for saying this, and I don't agree with Carl. I mean, I don't think that it's purely a case of, well, it's our country and therefore it's our. I think actually the Anglosphere is a better way of life. I'm so convinced of this. I believe in the superiority of Anglo-American culture. It's why Anglo-American culture has been so technologically and economically successful, and I think morally better. It's why the Anglo-American powers defeated Nazi Germany. It's why they defeated German militarism in the First World War. It's why they stood up and freed the world from Soviet communism during the Cold War. It's why in the West, paradoxically, we've created a group of academics and leftists who critique Western culture precisely because Western culture has created this sort of suicidal empathy, if you like. But I digress. Once you begin to ditch cultural relativism, and once you recognize what I would argue is the superiority of Anglo-American culture, suddenly the premise on which you have had mass immigration crumbles. It collapses. The veneer disintegrates on contact with these ideas. And we're starting to see this in real time. This is why I was slightly surprised when I read The Telegraph and I saw my own word remigration in there. I was kind of half expecting someone to cut it out or edit it or say the rest of it's great. The bits on planning and reform of the judiciary are fine, but can you just take out this bit on remigration? And they didn't. And I think that's a really significant milestone. Once the moral authority of the multiculturalists and the universalists collapses, and it is collapsing now, anything becomes possible.
Yes, I think the rape gangs have been a very significant developments in that regards. But it still seems that there's perhaps a libertarian tension around this idea of stripping people of citizenship, much as there might be people in Britain whom we would not want to have passports like ours. It could perhaps be overreach, or it could perhaps be an authoritarian precedent for a state to be able to disintegrate it.
I started out as a libertarian, and I still call myself a libertarian, but I'm sadly of the view that actually libertarianism, the idea of us as free individual agents, free to do what we want, and organic self-design, I think that only works within a Western, ultimately Christian ethical framework. I think it requires a distinctly Northwestern European form of family formation.
Do you mean not incestuous?
Non-clannish. I don't think libertarianism and free markets work in, for example, Pakistani societies where there is such a high instance of distrust that you marry into your clan and you have such a high instance of cousin marriage. I think we tend to think that culture is separate from hardware. I actually think human software culture is actually informed by hardware. If you have a society where you've had a long history of cousin marriage, you will have a culture informed by that is low trust on outsiders. You cannot have an Ayn Rand utopia in a country with clannish vibes, clannish norms, clannish outlooks. It simply doesn't work. Libertarianism works ultimately in societies where there is a sort of a Northwestern European family formation and a Christian ethical framework. Why? Because that treats people as individuals. It gives them an autonomy free from the clan, free from the tribal identity. If you want to have a libertarian society, a free society, and I do, you have to recognize that libertarian societies exist within a walled garden. And there are bad things outside that walled garden, and you need to maintain the wall. Libertarians, I think, sometimes recognize that if you have a welfare state, you cannot have free movement of people. The two are incompatible. It's libertarians beginning to recognize that the ideas of Hayek and Friedman and the ideas of spontaneous order and organic design, that they don't work universally. They're a product of Western thought and Western civilization. Sure, you can expand Western thought and Western civilization and Western culture and thereby expand libertarianism. But libertarian systems do not work in ultimately non-Western societies.
You talk about this garden of Western culture or the Anglosphere. And I would like to know what you think we could grow in this garden if milestones is enacted. What are the great things we could together achieve if we can sort out state capacity in the manner that you describe?
I mean, I'm a huge believer in what Elon Musk alludes to about and I was brought up in a third world country where most people lived in mud huts, and I had it drummed into me at a very early age that there was no limit on human ingenuity. The only limit on human ingenuity were the constraints humans put upon one another. And I'm a great believer in that. I think if you free human ingenuity, we're on the cusp of a huge upward trajectory. People talk about a singularity. I won't use that term, but I think technologically anything is possible. I think within my lifetime, people will be able to have a standard of living that today we associate with millionaires, but by working 2-3 days a week. I already noticed that here in Mississippi, it is possible to have a Tesla and pay a monthly amount equivalent to what it costs you in the UK to subscribe to a mobile phone. We're seeing this great explosion in economic and technological possibility. The only question is, are we going to kill the golden goose? Are we going to stifle the innovation by Europeanizing America and destroy Europe with overregulation? The race is on. Musk talks about whether we will colonize Mars before we destroy our ability to send a rocket there. I think he's right. I think like the late Romans, will we innovate fast enough so that we can hold back not so much the barbarians outside the gates, but the barbarians inside the city walls already? Who knows?
So you think it's really mud huts or Mars?
I don't really think there is much in between, because the default condition in human history is mud huts, and the default condition in human history, most societies don't innovate. Most societies don't produce anything. Most societies only grow rich because they emulate the Anglosphere or to some extent parts of East Asia. Most human capital is not very productive. It's John Galt. It's a handful of people from a handful of civilizations that drive pretty much everything. And if they forget, I think we're a civilization that's living on the fumes of our past, and we've forgotten what it is. There's a wonderful book by Tom Holland, Dominion, and
which I regard actually as my Bible, even more so than the Bible.
It slightly changed my view about a lot of things, because I hadn't really appreciated the extent to which the Christian inheritance informs the world today. And we're kind of living on the fumes of that. And if those fumes go, we can already see a Western innovative country like Britain, a country that was a pioneer of aviation, de Havilland, a country that created the jet engine, penicillin, a country that's now basically stalled. We've basically become I was going to say Argentina, but Argentina has now actually become a first world country, or on its way to becoming a first world country. We've seen a first world country stall. Now, it may be temporary, it may be permanent. If we introduce milestones, I think it will be a glitch rather than a permanent feature. But it only takes a few countries to stall, and the whole system stalls. Don't imagine that China is going to be a great innovator. China's great innovation is an aberration. They had Deng Xiaoping 30 years ago, who removed the self-constraints on Chinese innovation. You had 30 years of growth. Xi is putting those constraints back. China is not going to be a great innovator. China's population will stall, its innovation will stall if President Xi carries on doing what he's doing now. They will go back to being like the Ming, potentially great, but never more than potentially. Europe, they're on holiday from history. Under the current disposition of an EU-led Europe, they're on a hiding to nothing. Russia, forget it, demographically in a mess. The only innovation they produce is new ways of trying to kill their neighbors. It leaves pretty much everything to the United States. And the United States came perilously close to becoming a sort of giant version of California. It's only really Musk, I think, who's hopefully going to avert that disaster.
Could I actually, you bring up California, I just would like to ask, because California, you're right, is a place with very high taxes. and yet has been able to achieve this great amount. Do you think that is now disappearing, and that's why we get this Southern American renaissance?
Fumes. I mean, California is doing phenomenally well, and if you look at the GDP statistics, it's phenomenally rich because of legacy, fumes. They've got tech startups, which mean that you've got a huge number of very successful legacy businesses, which has made a tiny number of people in California phenomenally wealthy. And you've got this great sort of now sprawling, almost Latin American underclass underneath it. And the middle class has largely abandoned California. They're moving in very, very large numbers to Arizona and the mountain states. It's one of the reasons why you get so much growth in Arizona. A lot of businesses are leaving California. Tesla very famously moved from California with its ruinous legal and regulatory regime to Texas. The real untold story of America, I think, is the Southern success story. The Southern US has become it went from being a sleepy backwater for 150 years after the Civil War, 100 years after the Civil War, to becoming demographically the biggest region of America. It's economically, bankers are literally leaving New York and moving to Miami. Companies are moving from California to Texas. I see this in Mississippi. We've had $25 billion worth of inward investment in the past 4 years since I've been here. In a state of 3 million people, that's a big deal. What kind of companies are moving? Data centers, Amazon Web Services, high-tech companies that use a lot of energy. There's a lot of cheap energy here because we haven't gone in for that green stuff. So you're starting to see in the US South this phenomenal growth. I sometimes say to some of my non-Southern friends in America, we all know that the North once saved the American Republic in the Civil War. What we're going to see now is the Southern US, the Southern bloc, save America by its example of low taxes and deregulation and innovation. The Southern American economic model is really showing great promise. I mean, Texas has gone from being a state known for, hee-haw cowboys and oil to astronauts and AI. You've got this phenomenal growth in Florida and Tennessee. It's cultural as well. Nashville and Austin are where any ambitious young American now wants to move to. Mississippi has exported people for generations. That has now started to change. We're now a net importer of people and talent. You're starting to see this great Southern success story. UK can learn from it, Europe can learn from it, but I think the rest of America is learning from it too.
I think energy is a really interesting part of this. Texas, of course, has its history of oil. Texas is also one of the states, I think, with the most promising solar and geothermal schemes. And that's not because the Texan legislature is particularly interested in these things. It's because it's easy to plug things into the grid. And of course, there's a lot of sunshine and that kind of thing as well. But the clean energy breakthroughs are not necessarily coming from the blue states.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a huge convert to Tesla. I'm sort of gearing up to actually switch to Tesla. And
but you want to dismantle net zero. So please explain.
It's just economic sense. I mean, they're actually giving them away. I mean, why wouldn't I? I would certainly want to keep a car with petrol for gas, as they call it here, for long distance driving. If I go from Jackson, Mississippi to Oxford, a 3-hour drive, or from here to Tennessee or Louisiana, but for pootling around my neighborhood, I'm gearing up to get a Tesla. And here's the other thing: I went to the Tesla showroom, and they've got this wonderful deal where you put solar panels on your house, and it charges up a battery. I'm currently looking at the economics of that. You've got lots of solar power here. And I think that's a rather wonderful idea. Now, I don't currently live in what I would regard as my forever home. But when I do, I'm going to look into that because I think that's really exciting. But I'm not doing that because it's green. I'm doing that because it's cheap. It's really, really cheap. Electricity here is already really cheap because if you buy it off the electricity producer, they get it off natural gas, overwhelmingly, partly nuclear power. And you might say, well, Texas, Mississippi, they've got oil and gas. Well, what do you think sitting in the rock under Lancashire? What do you think sitting in the North Sea? The UK has got gazillions of tons of this stuff. You've just got a law that makes it illegal to extract it. So you could be part of this hydrocarbons revolution too. I I think solar is going to take off big time, but it's not going to take off big time because it's greeny nonsense. It's going to take off because it's economic sense, particularly in the southern US where you've got lots of sunshine.
And what is greeny nonsense? Are you a climate change skeptic?
I mean, the climate is in a perpetual state of change. It has been throughout recorded history. One thing that is clear to me is that there are two extremes in the Earth's climate. It's either cold and dry, which is pretty horrific for life on Earth. When you have one of these periods of cold and dry, it's bad news to be any kind of animal or plant on Earth. Or you have a period that is warm and wet. And when the conditions on Earth are warm and wet, it is a good time to be a species of plant or animal on planet Earth. It's not clear to me that human activity is driving the changes. We seem to be moving into a warm and wet period. This is a good thing. It's one of the reasons why we're seeing the great greening with a lot more green coverage. The Sahel in Africa is retreating. When I was growing up in Africa in the 70s and the 80s, people always told us that the Sahel was expanding and the desertification of Africa would be a phenomenon. It seems actually that process is in reverse. More and more of the Sahel is disappearing. You're getting the great greening. I don't think this has anything to do with human activity. I think a lot of it is solar activity.
You don't. It's interesting. You don't think it's human. It's human accelerated.
I think it's marginal around the edges. I mean, CO2 is basically a form of plant food. I don't really think that it's particularly harmful. Now, what I think would be really harmful is if some clever dick put large volumes of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere, because there's some evidence that when you have a volcanic explosion that emits vast numbers of sulfur dioxide, that does have an effect on cooling. And actually, in recorded history, there have been a number of instances of harvest failure in Europe and Asia linked to, some would suggest, volcanic eruptions. So I think that rather like COVID, it's not the virus that's the risk. It's the stupidity of the technocratic elite's response to it. What terrifies me is not climate change. It is people saying they're going to pump out billions of tons of sulfur dioxide to mitigate against it or something like that. No, please, please, please don't do that. I'm very, very skeptical that man-made climate change is the problem people say that it is. And to the extent that the world is getting warmer and wetter, I think that is a good thing for the human condition. I suspect naturally anyway, technology means that we're going to use long-term less oil and gas because people like me will switch to solar paneling because it's economic to do so. I don't think it requires state intervention.
Well, Duncan, we've got a few questions that listeners have actually submitted. Firstly, do you think it's possible for the Conservative Party to return to a fiscally sensible form of historically informed conservatism? And if so, are there any individuals in the current Conservative Party that might be able to achieve that?
Gosh, I hope they do. I really, really do. Now, I've had some experience trying to set up an insurgent party. I quit the Conservative Party for UKIP. I'm not a card-carrying conservative. I so often I've looked with despair at what they've done in office. I hope they get their act together. I think if you want Britain to do well, it's good to see the Conservative Party do well, and for that matter, Reform to do well. We want them to compete for these innovative ideas. But right now, I think they're a long way from where they need to be. I'm deliberately avoiding getting into the business of should it be this person or that person. I would just say I think Robert Jenrick stands out as quite impressive. He has found a way of articulating what needs to be articulated, and he does it not through the mainstream media, through the sort of the Cathy Newman interview. He does it directly. And I've been quite struck by both his tone, which I think is right, but also what he's saying. So I think there's hope there.
Do you ever expect to return to British politics?
No. I ran for office 5 times. I got re-elected every time I ran. I co-founded Vote Leave, the official Brexit campaign. It takes it out of you. I mean, it really does take it out of you. I feel I've done my bit. I also didn't particularly enjoy being in politics. I found it quite frustrating. I disliked having any reference to being an MP in my home. I tried to discourage my daughter from ever reading or listening or hearing about what I was doing in politics. I find it intrusive and slightly sort of vulgar, if I may say, being in public office. There are other people who can do it much better than I can. My job is to, I think, help them, offer advice where I can, provide a script where I can, and to wish them well. I think I can be more effective by supporting others who I think can do a better job than I ever could.
Well, on that topic, Douglas, we would love to know who the figures in Westminster are who are interested in milestones.
I'm not going to say specific things deliberately because I've been approached by people in two of the three main parties, and I don't have a dog in the fight. I don't really care who does it. I just want it done. And I will help them in any way I can. And one of the ways I can help them, I think, is to offer advice without being in the spotlight.
Another question from a listener is, can we take any lessons from Viktor Orban's Hungary in achieving the manifesto? Would you regard Fidesz as a conservative and libertarian party?
I just don't know. And I'm in two minds. Thought number one is that he is a pro-Putin nationalist who is doing and saying all the wrong things and is a vulgar populist and all the rest of it. But look how wrong I have been in the past when I bought that line. Maybe people like him are a necessary corrective to the control of their societies by unaccountable bureaucrats. Maybe he recognizes some of the demographic challenges that Hungary faces that we all need to recognize. Maybe his opposition to mass immigration is what's really important and significant about him, and not the minutiae of whether he fits in with the Davos crowd and sings Kumbaya with the Davos crowd when it comes to Ukraine. So I hope I have the humility to say I don't know. If it's the case that Orban is awful, if it's the case that he's dreadful, and that he is a low benchmark, what the heck does that say about every other Western European government? Because I can't see what's so great about them. So,
well, they're decent, isn't it? They're able to maintain the veneer of sensible, decent behaviour. Decent behaviour that allowed 2.5 incompatible immigrants into Britain in 24 months. Decency which put us under house arrest during COVID because a group of people panicked that it might lead, a seasonal flu epidemic might kill us. Decency that bankrupted the country with lockdown spending. Decency that turned its blind eye to what was going on in Rotherham. Maybe it's time for a bit of indecency. I think put very well. Well, I think we will start wrapping up, but I will ask, firstly, what is next for the ideas in Milestones, and what should energetic listeners who have heard what you've said and are have been convinced? I think we should be open to people being convinced. That is our aim. What should they be doing, and how can they move forward to advocate for these forms of policies?
I mean, I think one thing is read it and tell me where it's wrong and where it's right and where it can be better. I sort of wrote Milestones in isolation, almost in Mississippi as a side hustle in evenings and weekends. And I think there are things about it that can be improved. I don't, for example, have a detailed answer to post getting rid of the Supreme Court judicial reform. I haven't thought through all the minutiae of some of the red tape reduction. There'll be people watching this who have a far better idea, or who read what I've written and think, actually, that's not quite right. Please come forward. Collaborative efforts, whether it's writing software or building businesses or writing proposals for future government, collaborative efforts are greater than individual efforts. Great innovation is always a team effort. So please read it and let me know how it can be improved. I would ask that people think about what needs to be done before they get wrapped up in the business of who to vote for. I think part of the problem in politics, and I see this with clarity now, part of the problem in politics is that, and I was guilty of it, you tend to think of your team or this person or that person, Tweedledee versus Tweedledum, and you project onto them what you want to see, often with very little basis for doing so. And you assume the worst about the others. Maybe I would ask people to figure out how we can fix the country before you get obsessed with which party to support. And one final thing, don't listen to the mainstream media anymore. They're deeply depressing, and they are designed to demoralize you. Their entire assumption about politics is that you should be demoralized and switch off. One of the great things about moving to America that improved the quality of my life was that I was out of range of the Today program and Channel 4 News. I suddenly realized that I was in a much better mood in the mornings, and I was even occasionally smiling first thing in the morning. And I realized this is because I didn't have to listen to Radio 4. So switch it off. And with that, I think we will wrap up. Thank you, Douglas, very much for speaking to us. I think I think what you have provided here with this at this level of granular detail is an important step towards the Great Repeal Bill that people like us, I think, are hoping can get Britain back on its feet. So thank you. Well, final thing, have you ever reached out to Dom Cummings at all? We didn't talk about him, but is he on your radar? Dominic Cummings, he has agreed to come on the podcast and then has gone quiet on us. So it's a battle of ours to try and Mercurial Dom. Exactly, Mercurial pin him Dom. Down. I mean, yeah, he's at a lot of these events. Are you familiar with the LFG campaign? I am, and I'm very sympathetic to what they're trying to do, and I've reached out to a couple of them. I think granular detail is what they need to come up with. It's all very well to say, wouldn't growth be nice, kumbaya. It's all very well for Dom to say the Cabinet Office is beastly. Okay, great. Which standing orders and orders in council are you going to change? When Dominic was in office, he was presented with a blueprint to do some of this stuff, and I don't think took that opportunity the way he could have done. So I think you should definitely tease him out. It's all very well to say that the cabinet system of government is a charade. It's all very well to riff on the theme of ministers being in office but not in power. Okay, we all get that now. What are you going to do? And I hope Milestones is a blueprint. And if you don't like that blueprint, great. But what is your better idea? And I think looking for growth and Dominic need to actually address that. I think that's really where the conversation now needs to go. Yeah, I think it's a very good point. And I think it's one that the British right needs to professionalize, pull itself together and start thinking about not just protest, but as you say, the diagnosis has been made. It's time for the remedy. Yeah. And some people are better at explaining the problem than addressing it. Milestones addresses it. Well, we will put Milestones in the show notes so that listeners can read it, and they should, because it is both a very compelling and very heartening document, I think, to read, because it's like reading IKEA furniture. You follow the instructions, and then at the end, you have for yourself a functional government. I hope the instructions are slightly easier than IKEA's to follow. We really would be. Well, Douglas, I think it could have done with more pictures. Would have been my only comment. Where, Douglas, can people read more of your work? I've got a Substack. Which I've only really just started, actually. I started it in order to post Milestones on there. So have a look at that. I also I run Mississippi's leading think tank, one of the leading think tanks in the southern US, the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. So go onto the website, give us your email address, and every Saturday I will send you an email. Now, often the email will be about income tax abolition in Mississippi, or what we're doing to lower energy costs in Mississippi, or what we're doing to allow more labor market flexibility in Mississippi. But that will certainly keep you up to date on my latest. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for listening. Goodbye to all our listeners. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Calum. Been great being on your show. Thank you, Douglas. It's been riveting.
This has been an episode of the Anglo-Futurism podcast. For more episodes, make sure you subscribe at anglofuturism.substack.com. That's anglofuturism.substack.com.